entering. I'd like to start the training off. So, Jing, if you're ready for the presentation. Okay, again, welcome everyone to Georgia EPD's 2024 kickoff training for point source emissions inventory. My name is Ruben Gihan Felix. I'm the manager of the emissions control and strategies unit, which handles the point source emissions reporting for Georgia EPD. You'll be hearing some a bit from me today, but also from some of my staff engineers, Maria Gianci and also Emily Phillips, and we'll be going over the basics on how to report emissions for the 2024 year. So to begin, this is the outline for today's presentation. We'll be going over the regulatory background, which pretty much the rules that mandate states to collect emissions data and form an emissions inventory. We'll also be going over updates to said rules, potential updates, I should say. Then we'll be going over the combined air emissions reporting system, which is CARES. We refer to it as CARES a lot. So if you have ever heard that, we'll be going over the basics of CARES as well as HAPS guidance updates. Then we'll be going over the submittal walkthrough, touching on the Georgia quality assurance steps that we take at Georgia EPD. And lastly, we'll finish up with some helpful tips, resources, and next steps for facilities. To begin, I'll be going over the emissions inventory, the rules that essentially, again, mandate states to collect emissions and form an emissions inventory. That rule is highlighted here in that first bullet point. It's the 40 CFR Part 51, Subpart A, the air emissions reporting requirement rule. Again, this is where you will find sort of all the framework that mandates each individual state to collect their emissions data and form an inventory. This is also where you will find the specifics regarding the thresholds and whatnot. But not only that, there is a state rule which is shown there with Georgia Rule 391-3-1.026B1. That's the general rule that allows that gives the director freedom to essentially collect emissions data as well from the state side of things. So yeah, please note for the 2024 year, Georgia EPD will be requiring participating facilities to report their data by June 30th, essentially to allow time for state review and to quality assure any emission inventory submission. So next slide. Next, I'll be going over some of the thresholds that essentially determine if you are applicable to submit emissions data to us. So if you look on the right here, the table of annual potential thresholds, and potential being the key word. So these thresholds are based on PTE. So if your facility emits any pollutant or has a PTE above these thresholds, you would be required to submit your emissions data to Georgia EPD. There are some exceptions. So permitted but not constructed facilities would not have to submit an emissions inventory report. Facilities with federally enforceable permit limits would also not have to submit emissions data. And also facilities which were shut down during the entire calendar year would not submit their emissions to us. And if you notice these thresholds, if you were present or doing any reporting last year, you would notice that these thresholds have changed since the last year. This is because 2024 is what is referred to as an annual year. There are two different types. There's an annual year and a triennial year. The triennial years, those happen every 3 years, and 2023 was one of those. So with triennial years, you will find lower lower thresholds. But again, since 2024 is annual, these thresholds are generally higher. Also, please note, in a triennial year, again, not this year, PTEs are, lead is based on actual emissions, but again, that's for triennial year. So next slide. So I'll now be going over some of the proposed rule revisions to the AERR. So on July 25th, 2023, so last year, EPA, they announced some proposed revisions to the AERR. They gave states a comment window where we could submit any comments, which a lot of states chose to participate in, and Georgia included. But as a summary, some of the proposed revisions or changes to the rule included new deadlines for criteria air pollutant reporting. That new proposed deadline would be March 31st, 2031, which is a much earlier deadline than what it is now. It also included mandatory hazardous air pollutant reporting. As of now, it's not mandated across the board. Georgia actually is a voluntary. It's voluntary to report your HAPs in the state of Georgia. So this revision would make it so that this would become mandatory. There's also proposed changes in reporting thresholds. They would go away from the triennial annual year differences, and it would all essentially become pretty much every year would have the same threshold. There is also changes regarding data collection requirements for small generating units, mobile sources, and portable sources. There's changes regarding emissions data no longer being entitled to confidential treatment. So as of now, you're still able to do that, but again, these changes would essentially go away from that. And lastly, there were also changes regarding requiring the use of electronic reporting for certain source tests. Sorry. Next slide. So now I'll be going over what CARES is. So CARES is the Combined Air Emissions Reporting System. This is an application developed by EPA, and it pretty much allows facilities to report emissions to Georgia, where we can then submit this emission data to the NEI, or the National Emissions Inventory. Georgia EPD is responsible for the quality assurance of these emissions data before it gets sent to the NEI. And any HAPs data submitted to CARES is available to use in the TRI, or Toxics Release Inventory. Once a facility has certified the report, EPD does not need to approve the report before the data is available to use in the TRI. TRI data is actually certified separately through the TRI ME web. So yeah, those are just some specifics on what CARES is. So next slide. Please note, so there are two different types of roles in CARES, what we refer to as CARE user roles. So there's a preparer and a certifier. A preparer is able to create the initial report and enter data. There can be more than one preparer per facility, but they cannot certify the report. The second user role type is a certifier, and a certifier can do everything a preparer is able to do in CARES, but is also responsible for certifying the report. There can only be one certifier per facility. These user roles, the preparer and certifier accounts in CARES, they may be used for multiple facilities, and the user does not need to create multiple accounts to report for multiple facilities. Next slide. So now I'll be handing it over to Emily Phillips, who is our HAPS specialist in ECSU, and Emily will be going over the HAPS guidance updates.
Okay, thanks, Ruben. Since EPA released the proposed AERR, we've been working to modify our plans for a Georgia HAPS inventory. Until HAPS reporting is planned to be mandatory in 2026, we still encourage facilities to voluntarily report HAPS to CARES. For the 2025 emissions inventory, the pilot program will focus on experience and timelines of submitting HAPS. Like we have said before, any HAPS submitted to CARES will be available for use in TryMe Web. Note that certification in CARES does not mean you've certified any TRI submissions. Toxics air data are certified through TryMe Web, again, not in CARES. Next slide. If your facility chooses to voluntarily submit HAPs, the process of entering them into CARES is the same as it is for the criteria air pollutants. One important note is that HAPs should still be included in their corresponding criteria air pollutant. For example, any hazardous pollutants that are also VOCs should be included in the VOC total. This is not double counting. CAPs and HAPs are kept separate in terms of the data. However, HAPs are not kept separate from each other. So there might be HAPs that overlap, such as chromium and hexavalent chromium, and the EPA submittal program does not like that. Please just report one of those two pollutants. In any cases of overlap, only report one overlap. HAPs reporting to TRI should match what is reported in CARES, regardless of whether you use CARES reporting to TRI. Next slide. Now we'll walk through the process of the 2024 Georgia Point Source Emissions Inventory. This process has three main parts. First, reporters will need to update a facility and contact information. Next, they will determine whether the Title V facility qualifies to be opt-in or opt-out. And finally, they'll submit their EI report or their opt-out determination in CARES. The first step is to go into Gecko to update your facility information. So here you find the link, and you'll have to register for an account if you've never accessed Gecko. Returning users with the emissions inventory access will have the facility's name listed and that emissions inventory box checked. You will click on the facility name to access any EI form. For new users, you will need to request access to your facility using the Request Access Facility button at the bottom of the page. Next slide. This screen is where reporters request access to their facility. So make sure to check the EI box and review the admin users listed. If the admin users are unavailable for whatever reason, or you need any assistance regarding access, please check the box that corresponds to that statement. If admin users are available, an email will be sent to them. If not, it's sent to us. Gecko will show a preview of that email before it is sent. Next slide. When you click on the facility name on the Gecko homepage, you will arrive at the facility homepage. The User Access tab allows the facility admins to change their user access. The Communication Preferences tab can be changed here, but will also be pointed out within the form. And the emissions inventory link is where you can access the 2024 emissions inventory application information. Next slide. The Gecko form is formatted to be more streamlined. So first step, once you're in the emissions inventory application, is to review the facility information. If any facility information is incorrect, please let us know by emailing us at the email listed on this page or at the end of this presentation. The next codes here must match what is listed in CARES. And also note that the coordinate system used in both Gecko and CARES is the WGS84, which is the datum used by Google Maps. So unless your facility is using the not standard Google Maps coordinates, this should match with what you have in your records. Next slide. So next you'll want to update your contact information, which includes your main emissions inventory contact and the CARES users roles. The instructions indicate to update the main emissions inventory contact first. When updating the emissions inventory contact, the link will open with the communications preferences into another tab. You'll select the emissions inventory link on the left-hand side to access the input fields. Once you save that contact information, you can close out of this screen. Next slide. The next step is to update the CARES users that you may need to add or modify users at the beginning of the year. The contact information is important to fill out first in Gecko because this is how we certify the users in CARES. We'll compare what's in Gecko first before approving anything in CARES. If it doesn't match, that could lead to delays in the user gaining access in CARES. Something to remember, you can change your username or your users at any time throughout the year if something changes, and the same person can be both preparer and certifier. If there is only one, if the certifier is acting as a preparer, they should be listed as both roles. Next slide. This year, emails will be sent to facilities that will indicate whether a facility is likely to qualify to opt out or report. In this email, we will indicate the potential to emits that were submitted to Georgia EPD during the permit application or in previous opt-out forms. If the facility agrees with these numbers, then they can use the PDF of that email as confirmation. If the facility disagrees for whatever reason with those PTEs, they can submit a revised opt-out form, which can be downloaded on this screen. This screen also provides instructions to the new CDX or CARES users. You can use the green link here to access CDX, and this year CARES will launch the 2024 emissions inventory on January 6th. Next slide. The opt-out form is the same as it's been for a few years. You'll note the emissions thresholds are updated for the annual year as opposed to the triennial year last year. If your facility must complete the opt-out form, you will need to fill out the correct PTE information and select whether those potential to emits come from a permit limit or a permit application. The column on the right will indicate what justification is needed for that facility. And you'll put the permit condition if it's a permit limit and the application number if it was a PTE calculated as a part of the application. Next slide. So when you begin your report in CARES, you'll see 2 opt-in questions before CARES generates your report. The first question is whether your facility was operating in the 2024 year. If your facility was not operating, then you will be able to opt out without any additional information needed. Note that facilities that have never operated, including under construction, do not need to submit anything to the emissions inventory. If for whatever reason you've received an email from us, just let us know and we'll remove your facility from CARES for the 2024 year, and we'll add it back in once the facility has begun operation. Next slide. The second question is about those potential to emit thresholds. If your facility is below all of the thresholds, then CARES will generate a blank emissions inventory report where you'll attach either your PDF of the opt-out email or a copy of your opt-out form if any PTE need correcting. Next slide. So this is an example of a blank opt-out emissions inventory report. So you'll attach your documentation and then certify the report. No additional reporting needed. Next slide. If a facility is operating above any thresholds, then CARES will generate an emissions inventory report based on the previous year to begin. Next slide. So now I'll pass it on to Maria to talk about Georgia's quality assurance process.
Thanks, Emily. So CARES conducts automatic QA checks that the user can address when completing the emission inventory. Additionally, we conduct our own QA checks that have not yet been implemented in CARES or are Georgia specific. For facilities who are opting out, the emission inventory team will check what the facility has provided against our records to make sure everyone's on the same page. We check that temporarily or permanently shut down facilities are opting out for the correct year. For example, if a facility operated part of 2024 but temporarily shut down for the rest of the year, then the facility is still considered operating in 2024. If your facility is no longer a Title V facility starting at some point in 2023, then you should have not received an email. If you have, please reach out to us and we will address the issue. For co-located facilities, we will check to ensure that they are reporting based on collective PTE totals. This affects co-located facilities whose PTEs add up together to exceed thresholds. In this case, both facilities would need to report. For control devices, we check what facilities list against the previous CARES entry and the corresponding applicable permit. Additionally, we will check that controlled pollutants are listed with both the control device and control path. Next slide. For SCC codes, please refrain from using the general SCCs. In some cases, it's justifiable, but we will review all general SCCs used to determine if there is a more specific code to represent the emission process. There is one that is like 3 and has like a bunch of 9s, which is like general industrial and general process, and that's one that we're refraining from using. For any zero throughput and emissions, they should be marked as temporarily shut down or permanently shut down. If that is the situation, there is an exception which will be mentioned in a later slide. For significant facility-wide emission changes, we're going to check the throughput or any change in emission factor to determine why there may have been a change in CAPS and HAPS. We will look for a facility-provided explanation if we cannot reach a conclusion through those means. For CAPS, any facility-wide emissions change of greater than 20% will trigger a check. For HAPS, it is greater than 10%. CARES has no decimal limits, but 6 decimal points are preferred. Please don't round your emissions to whole numbers. Next slide. These are some screenshots from one of our QA spreadsheets where we check for emissions correctness and reproducibility. Our spreadsheet has built-in formulas that take into consideration the provided inputs, but if it can't calculate, then we manually review those entries. When a material is a fuel, enter the fuel material first in the CARES user interface, then use the copy fuel data to throughput data fields button, which you can see in the lower right-hand corner. This duplicates the entry to the throughput fields. If you're in the bulk upload template, ensure you type in the same information for both the throughput and fuel fields. Additionally, we check for heat content when a fuel is the process throughput. If you don't have one, please use the default heat content ratios for CARES PDF, which can be found in the EPA CARES webpage. And we'll provide that link later in the presentation. Next slide. Emission factors, throughput values, operating hours, and any other information used to calculate emissions should be included in CARES. Attachments are reserved for material balance and engineering judgment calculation methods, unless there is additional information that needs to be provided for other calculation methods, and if it's difficult to include in the comment boxes. Do not use an attachment to avoid entering emission factors and other values into CARES. All pollutants must be recorded no matter how insignificant. Common missing criteria air pollutants that we see are typically ammonia and lead. Check your permit narrative for expected pollutants and ensure that they are all included in CARES. Another location that you can check for expected pollutants is WebFire. If the specific process does not actually emit that expected pollutant, go ahead and enter 0 and provide an explanation. You can use engineering judgment for the calculation method. This is the exception to marking zero emissions and throughput as temporarily shut down or permanently shut down, as mentioned in the previous slide. If an emissions unit emits PM, the facility must report 2 of the 3 components of PM10 and PM2.5. Georgia considers the 3 components as PM condensable, PM10 filterable, and PM2.5. And the last component is PM10 primary and PM2.5 primary. By reporting 2 of these components, EPA will be able to calculate the 3rd component, thus eliminating PM augmentation. This gives facilities control of their own data. However, if you do not have reliable sources to calculate all PM components, leave those blank and EPA will use their PM augmentation tool to estimate the missing components. Next slide. To identify different processes of each emission unit, source classification codes are used. There can only be one SEC for each process unless you're making use of an alternative throughput option, which will allow you to duplicate the process but use a different throughput unit of measure. Multiple processes of the same unit using the same SEC will result in a warning in CARES. So in this example, the same SEC for both combustion and the dryer process is used. So instead, the user needs to use an in-process fuel for the flash dryer instead of the flash dryer process for the combustion. Different fuels should have different in-process fuel SECs. To access the full SEC list, you can access this website listed at the bottom of the screen. You can use the interface to search for the SECs. And there's also a CSV file that you can download to get all of the SECs. Next slide. So this slide elaborates on operating hours. If using the bulk upload template, the average days per week, hours per day, and weeks per reporting period must equal hours per reporting period. Otherwise, the reporting system will change the hours entered in the template to the product of the 3 operating values. Note that the average days per week and average hours per day can be a decimal with up to 3 decimal places. Average weeks per reporting period and hours per reporting period can only be integers. In the CARES user interface, the hours per reporting period is automatically calculated and will be rounded to an integer. The next several slides, I will review what documentation will be needed for various emission calculation methods. For stack testing, there are 2 options, one without controls and one that includes the control efficiency and the emission factor. Please provide the test date, emission factor ratio if that applies, and where you got that ratio, and if applicable, provide any control information. Note there is a 100-character maximum, so you can use the other comment box for any overflow. For material balance, we are looking for more documentations with the emissions reported. For PM, we want density or specific gravity, solids content, and amount of material used. For VOC emissions, the data requirements are similar. You can provide this information in the description of calculation, or if it's more extensive, attach the documents in the report summary attachment section, which is like in the homepage of CARES within your profile. When using other emissions factor, please make sure to include all emission factor references. One possible application of the other emissions factor calculation method is when you're using an AP emission factor that is no longer an official EPA emission factor in CARES, but it's still the best available for your process. Include the reference in the emission factor description. And it's also best practice to not check I prefer to calculate the total emissions of this pollutant because that tends to lead towards rounding errors and other omitted calculation information. With engineering judgment, an emissions factor is not necessary, but can be useful if there is one. Provide the general methodology in the comments box and attach engineering judgment calculations in the report summary attachment. Finally, this is a table of some common warnings. Reviewers are going to rerun the quality checks at the beginning of the review. They'll review the warnings to see if they're addressed or not. If it's not clear if the warning doesn't apply, we will contact the facility reporter to determine why the warning was not addressed. All right, next slide. And the next are some just helpful tips for the 2024 emission inventory submittal. So when a reporter opens a facility report for the new emission inventory year, they will get a report creation log. This log provides insight on two types of changes that could have occurred. The first type of change occurs when there is a new EPA emission inventory data field update, like an updated emission factor, unit of measure correction, those kind of things. The second type of change are CARES data field overrides, which may happen when uploading the bulk upload template into CARES. One major example is when the hours per reporting period doesn't add up to the three values that are entered in the bulk upload template. So it'll override and create and actually do the calculation. Next slide. When entering new emission units from within the user interface, use emission unit and control device nomenclature that matches what is in the permit. However, if they do not currently match, don't modify the IDs that are already entered in CARES. To help EPD reviewers, you can provide the matching unit ID in the description or somewhere in the comments. For new emission units or even just making edits to your report, it is helpful to know the general order of emissions data entry. It is generally emission unit first, followed by process entry. Then you can add the pollutants, release point, control device, and then finally path. And then to connect it all, you'll connect it through the release point. You'll connect the release point to the process, which in turn connects the control and the control path. So you'll go to the process level and seek out the release points associated with the process window. And when you select the control path, you will associate the controls with the process. And I'll reiterate this in a later slide. And this slide just provides a detailed flow of how to enter emission units and all of its associated components. It also cross-references where you can find more information in the latest CARES user guide. And this is just another way of looking at or like a walkthrough of the controls, but from the view of fixing the error. So you'll first access the process through the emissions inventory menu on the left-hand side of the page. On the process level page that opens, find the release points associated section, which is on the right side of the page, and select the edit button, which is a box with a pencil in it. Then you'll add the control path in the release point apportion menu. Next slide. This slide applies to facilities who have previously set up their emission inventory and do not have any emission units, processes, or control devices to add. So this is a great tool to use to update throughputs from within the user interface, and you don't have to update anything else. Like you don't have to edit the emission unit itself. So this year they've actually added the fuel material to the process information tab. And so again, if you're entering a fuel material, then both values must be entered and must be the same. So this slide refers to the feedback report that we get when we transmit your report to EPA. We get these critical errors, and then we'll reach out to you to get it corrected. And so these are some resolutions to make the corrections. And I'm not going to go through it. It's just here for a reference. So resources and next steps. So our training, PowerPoint and recording will be on our emission inventory website. And once we make any corrections on the PowerPoint, if needed, and when we get the recording, we'll upload it here. For the CARES user guide and past EPA CARES webinar recordings, they are posted on this website. EPA is holding training starting December 16th, which is they are going to just do an overview of CARES for new reporters. In January, they'll have 3 more. User interface will be held January 16. Bulk upload template will be January 21st. Control paths will take place January 30th. They'll post the training recordings on their website, but it takes some time. So because they have to do accessibility or address accessibility requirements, and but you can see some older recordings currently on the website. We will hold virtual help sessions every Tuesday and Thursday from February to July, and we're not providing any extensions or help sessions after July 15th. We're going to QA your emission inventory data as soon as it is submitted. However, once it's like peak submittal time, it might slow down. So best to get it submitted earlier. And we'll reach out to you to fix any errors or data verifications. And with that, we just want to thank you for helping us maintain our emissions inventory and for making sure it's accurate as much as possible. It is vital for reaching our goal of improving our air quality in the state of Georgia. So we thank you so much for your hard work and cooperation. Now we'll take questions. You can enter them into the chat or raise your hand. And if you think of any other questions, please reach us out, emissions.inventory@dnr.ga.gov. All right, so the first question that we have in the chat is mandatory HAPs after 2026. Emily, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is only if the proposed AERR rule is finalized or is made official.
Correct. At least right now, that's we're waiting on EPA to either finalize that or announce that they are not finalizing that, and then move forward from there if we need to.
Okay, Jackie?
Yes, I have a question. When you